In 432 BCE, Athens enacted the Megarian Decree, a full trade embargo against Megara to punish its encroachment on sacred land. The result wasn't submission, it was war. Sparta responded, Athens faltered, the empire fractured, not because Megara was strong, but because trade-based coercion misfired. That failure echoes through time and, as multiple Cato analyses have shown, reflects a deeper truth about sanctions. They're less instruments of coercion than acts of political theater. From the Athenian embargo to the modern treasury blacklist, their primary function has often been to send a signal to the target, to allies, and to a domestic audience, rather than to compel real change. Once understood as messaging tools dressed up as economic warfare, their strategic flaws become clear. Sanctions were meant to be precise instruments, but all too often they become blunt, default tools, easy to launch, hard to measure, hard to unwind. And over the centuries, they have evolved from strategic leverage into a reflex, accessible, instantaneous, but seldom effective. Let's fast forward to modern Iran and Yemen. For over 4 decades, the US built layer upon layer of sanctions, banking restrictions, oil export bans, asset freezes, secondary sanctions on third parties, and so on. The goal was to strangle Tehran, to target proxies, to compel strategic recalibration. But what we got was adaptation. The Houthis in Yemen were once a minor tribal insurgency. Today, they're a powerful militia capable of closing the Bab al-Mandeb, harassing shipping lanes, and launching drones at critical infrastructure. Their advance wasn't organic. It rode on the back of Iranian evasion infrastructure. With each new sanction on Iran, Tehran developed shadow fleets of tankers, front companies in East Asia, barter systems in Turkey, shell companies in UAE, and encrypted communications. These tools weren't just for survival. Eventually, they became instruments of projection. So fuel, weapons, intelligence, and finance now flow not just within Iran, but outwards to Hezbollah. Washington believed punishment would produce fear. Instead, it produced creativity, and crucially delivered exactly what domestic political strategists value. As Cato Institute's Richard Hananian notes, sanctions are politically convenient. They let leaders do something without deploying troops, inflict damage indirectly over time, and avoid the public backlash that comes with overt military action. This domestic utility explains why the tool survives repeated foreign policy failures. It serves home audiences well, even as it fails abroad. Then came Russia. The West believed that cutting off finance, technology, trade would isolate Moscow and break its government. Instead, it consolidated. When quantitative trade bans hit, Russian industry responded with domestic substitutes. Steel, lumber, aluminum, cement, all production numbers rebounded. Agribusiness responded too. Fertilizer plants reopened, and Russia continued to feed its population, trading with partners in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Consumer culture didn't vanish there either. Shelves emptied briefly in early 2022, but they refilled with sanctioned goods or domestic equivalents. The Snickers joke isn't hyperbole. It's evidence of economic pivoting at scale. While GDP dropped modestly by 2 to 3%, this was nowhere near the collapse predicted, and war funding kept going. The military budget rose year after year. Military industrial output stayed high. Russia didn't falter, it steered. That's what punishment without incentives looks like. Pressure that prompts redirection, not surrender. The pattern is clear across decades. From Panama in the 1980s to Syria in the 2010s, economic pain rarely forces capitulation on what states see as core interests. The Assad regimes endured a 75% GDP collapse, worse than Germany or Japan during World War II, under some of the most far-reaching sanctions, yet neither fell nor bent to U.S. demands. Meanwhile, public health degraded, basic goods disappeared, and civilian mortality spiked. Costs Washington seldom acknowledges. Europe paid the indirect price. When Russian gas and oil were severed, Europeans turned to LNG from Qatar and the U.S., but at prices 2 or 3 times higher. Winter heating costs soared. Households saw monthly bills double, even triple. Over a typical 6-month heating season, that added up to thousands of dollars per household in extra payments. Businesses were also squeezed. Food processors, chemical plants, fertilizer manufacturers, glassworks, all reported input costs of 50% or more. Some bare-bones manufacturers and family-run factories have closed down because the margins collapse under energy cost spikes. Consumer inflation has accelerated. Central banks responded by using rate hikes, which spooked markets that stifled growth and threatened a recession. Nations like Germany and Italy faced stagnation that's driven by energy shock. In sum, sanctions meant to squeeze an adversary ended up undercutting our allies, hollowing out budgets and fueling public discontent at home. Perhaps the most strategic boomerang of all, weaponizing the dollar. The U.S. cut Russian banks out of SWIFT and imposed secondary sanctions on any entity that did business with them. This pressure reverberated globally. Banks around the world started over compliance, steering clear of entire industries to avoid risk of U.S. penalties. Countries like Pakistan, Iraq, and Belarus found their access to dollars finance choked off. Meanwhile, BRICS nations responded by constructing alternatives. China expanded its cross-border payment system. India and the UAE began using rupees and dirhams in bilateral trade. Russia and Iran now routinely price oil and often sell it in yuan. So between 2016 and 2024, the dollar's share of global reserves fell from 60% to 54% in global trade exchange turnover. This dominance has shifted down to the low 50s. Meanwhile, central banks accumulated gold reserves and have started making their savings in other currencies. None of this happened overnight. But every time Washington resorts to sanctions and makes access to the dollar conditional on political alignment, it reinforces the incentive to innovate alternatives. And we're watching that innovation accelerate. The dollar may remain dominant, but its advantage is eroding through deliberate reactions to sanctions, not by chance. This is the structural flaw of the sanctions playbook. It's easy to implement, it's impossible to reverse, and it's poorly calibrated. They feel powerful, they signal resolve, but they lack nuance, adaptability, and vision. They don't deter the powerful. They hedge on reshaping the world by attrition. They hurt civilians more than elites. They pit nations against a bureaucratic web. They encourage alliances of convenience. They teach adaptability to adversaries, and they poison the incentives that could lead to legitimate dialogue. Sanctions were meant to be strategic reserve tools, rarely used, precisely targeted, paired with diplomacy. Instead, they become the default starting point, reflexive ritual, and divorced from larger strategy. Ronald Reagan once said that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to handle conflict sensibly. Sanctions once served that purpose. Now they undermine it. We have to rethink not whether sanctions are moral, but whether they are strategic. We must ask, can we use incentives and diplomacy before defaulting to punitive isolation? Can we tailor targets so narrowly that they land on elites' wealth, not on entire economies? Can we build off-ramps, clear conditions under which sanctions lift? Can we integrate regimes without destabilizing markets, without fueling retaliation, without hollowing out our allies? Sanctions should be the final prologue, not the opening act. They should arrive when all other tools have failed, when diplomacy has been tried, when strategy is clear, and when metrics exist, and then when an exit is planned. Reform is possible. Cato analysts suggest limiting sanctions to symbolic targets to preserve their political signal without mass civilian harm, building an automatic sunset clauses to prevent indefinite measures from going off forever into history, doing collateral damage to regular people. Without these guardrails, the sanctions reflex will keep eroding both moral credibility and strategic effectiveness. Athens thought an embargo would prevent war. Instead, it lit the fuse. Washington is making similar mistakes at a global scale. If we persist, if we keep confusing punishment with power, we won't just lose battles, we'll erode the systems that define American primacy. That system won't collapse overnight, but it will weaken until whole regions no longer operate in dollars, until allied trust slips, until influence becomes inertia. That is the era of adaptive resistance, and the clock is ticking.